Tell me you're joking, Joon-seo. The mustard-yellow silk of Han Soo-yeon's dress swished aggressively as she pointed a trembling finger at the woman standing in the Mafia boss's shadow. Her elegant face was twisted, disbelief battling with a slow-boiling rage. Kemi Adebayo stood frozen. The silver serving tray in her hands rattled, the green tea cup dancing precariously against a metallic container. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her deep brown skin flushing with a sudden, searing heat. She was just the maid, a girl in a blue uniform with a messy bun and a Peter Pan collar, yet the most powerful man in Gangnam was currently using her as a human shield. Kim Joon-seo didn't flinch. His hand, adorned with a luxury watch that cost more than Kemi's father's surgery, slid firmly around her waist, pulling her back against the sharp lapel of his blood-red suit jacket. "I don't joke about my property, Soo-yeon," Joon-seo said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet that vibrated through Kemi's spine. He leaned down, his sharp jawline brushing against Kemi's ear, though his alert, intense gaze remained locked on his ex-girlfriend. "The help," Soo-yeon shrieked, her voice cracking. "You're replacing me with the help." "She isn't the help anymore." Joon-seo's grip tightened, possessive and commanding. "She provides the heat you were too cold to handle. Kemi isn't just in my house, she's in my head, my bed, and every part of this empire you thought you could walk away from." He turned Kemi toward him, his fair skin a stark, polished contrast to her radiant mahogany glow. "Look at me, Kemi," he commanded softly, his eyes searching hers with a staged intensity that felt terrifyingly real. 21 days earlier, Kemi Adebayo had exactly 3 weeks left on her residency permit before the Seoul immigration office would escort her to Incheon Airport. At 26, with skin the color of rich earth and eyes that had seen too many closed signs, she was a woman running out of sky. She had come to South Korea with a suitcase full of lesson plans and a heart full of hope. English teacher turned corporate tutor turned unemployed. Each transition was a slip down a muddy slope she'd been desperate to climb. Now, the teaching academy was a ghost. Her final 2 months of pay had vanished into a bankruptcy filing, and her father's medical bills in Lagos were arriving with the frequency of a heartbeat. The Kim estate had been the final door on a long hallway of rejections. "It's a high-risk placement," the agency handler had whispered, sliding a thick confidentiality agreement across the table. "The pay is triple the standard rate, but the master, he is a man of complicated shadows. Kim Joon-seo. They say he was the architect of the Gangnam nightlife before the betrayal. Now he lives in a fortress of red silk and cold steel." "Is he violent?" Kemi had asked, her fingers hovering over the pen. "He is worse," the woman replied. "He is indifferent. 6 maids in 6 months. None could stand the silence. They say the house eats the light." Kemi had signed. Desperation had a way of turning a cage into a sanctuary. The Kim fortress sat on the edge of the city, a monolith of glass and security cameras. Mr. Park, the head of security with a face like weathered granite, had checked her apron and serving tray with the scrutiny of a customs agent. "The rules are simple," he'd growled in clipped tones. "Stay in the servants' quarters after 11 p.m., never speak unless spoken to. Do not move the art, and under no circumstances do you mention the name Han Soo-yeon." The mansion was beautiful and suffocating, filled with minimalist furniture and expensive art that seemed to mock Kemi's modest blue dress. For 3 weeks, she had been a ghost, delivering tea to a closed door and catching only glimpses of the man in the red suit. Until today. Until Soo-yeon broke the silence, and Joon-seo decided Kemi was the only weapon sharp enough to strike back. The humidity of Seoul's late summer felt like a physical weight as Kemi walked toward the iron gates of the Kim estate. Her fingers traced the frayed edge of her work permit inside her pocket, a piece of paper that felt more like a countdown. For 3 years, she had navigated this city with a smile that was slowly losing its shine. The prestigious English academy she'd moved for was now a boarded-up building in Mapo, and the vibrant life she'd promised her family in Lagos was dissolving into a series of panicked late-night wire transfers that didn't cover even half of her father's dialysis costs. "You're here for the domestic position," Mr. Park had stated more than asked, his shadow long against the marble entryway. He handed her the blue uniform. The fabric was stiff, smelling of industrial starch and the peculiar coldness of a house that hadn't seen a guest in years. As she pulled the white apron tight over her waist in the servants' quarters, Kemi caught her reflection. She looked like a relic of a different era, a stark contrast to the sharp, glass-and-steel geometry of the mansion. She smoothed her natural curls into a tight bun, swallowed her pride, and picked up the silver tray. Her first encounter with Kim Joon-seo didn't happen in a ballroom, but in the suffocating silence of his study. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and old grudges. He was silhouetted against a floor-to-ceiling window, the sunset bleeding behind him, casting his shadow across the dark oak floor. He wore a red suit jacket that seemed to glow in the fading light, a bold, violent splash of color in an otherwise monochromatic room. "Put it down," he said. He didn't turn around. His voice was a rasp, weary but laced with an authority that made the tray in Kemi's hands feel 10 times heavier. "Yes, Mr. Kim," she whispered. He finally turned, his sharp jawline catching the light. His eyes were not the eyes of a businessman. They were the eyes of a hunter who had been backed into a corner. He surveyed her, the blue dress, the deep mahogany of her skin, the visible tremor in her hands, with a clinical, freezing indifference. To him, she was just another piece of furniture to be moved. She was invisible. Or so she thought, until the day the front doors burst open and the past came screaming into the hall. The echoes of Soo-yeon's screeching exit still seemed to vibrate against the minimalist walls as the heavy mahogany doors of the study clicked shut. The adrenaline that had kept Kemi standing upright evaporated, leaving her knees weak. She set the tray on a side table with a clatter, her hands finally surrendering to the tremors she had suppressed in front of the Ice Queen. Joon-seo stood by the window, his red suit jacket discarded on a leather chair. In his black dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal the sleek watch and a hint of a forearm tattoo, he looked less like a boss and more like a predator contemplating his next move. "You performed well," he said, his back still turned. "Better than I expected for a woman who was supposedly just delivering tea." "I wasn't performing, Mr. Kim," Kemi replied, her voice steadying as her anger bubbled up. "I was being used. You didn't ask. You just grabbed me." He turned then, his polished features illuminated by the amber glow of the desk lamp. "I am offering you a way out of the gutter, Kemi. Soo-yeon will return, and when she does, she needs to see a lie so convincing it burns her. Play this part for 6 months. Be my shadow, my lover, my queen." He leaned across the desk, sliding a single sheet of paper toward her. The number written on it, in billions of one, made the air leave Kemi's lungs. It was enough to fly her father to the best surgeons in Europe and keep her family comfortable for a decade. "It's a contract," he continued. "You get the money, I get my revenge." Kemi looked at the staggering figure, then met his intense gaze. She knew the power he held, but she also knew her worth. "I have conditions." Joon-seo raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow. "Conditions?" "First," she said, standing tall in her blue uniform, "my visa. I want a permanent residency sponsorship, legally filed and untouchable. I won't be a fugitive in this country." She took a step closer, the Peter Pan collar framing a face set in stone. "And second, a dignity clause. You may own my time, Mr. Kim, and you may buy the appearance of my affection. But you do not own me. No physical intimacy without my consent, and you will never speak down to me in private. If we are to be lovers in public, we are equals in this room." For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, the corner of Joon-seo's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a spark of genuine interest. "Equal partners," he mused, reaching for a gold fountain pen. "Deal." The transformation didn't begin with a dress. It began with a siege. By dawn the next morning, the quiet of the East Wing was shattered by a phalanx of stylists, tailors, and skin specialists, all moving with the frantic precision of a pit crew. They stripped away the blue cotton and the starch of her former life, replacing the domestic uniform with silk robes that felt like cool water against her skin. Kemi sat for hours as nimble fingers unraveled her modest bun. They didn't try to hide her texture, they celebrated it. They worked with premium oils that made her natural curls coil with defiant, healthy luster, framing her face like a dark, intricate crown. When the makeup artist finished, Kemi's skin didn't look covered. It looked illuminated, a radiant mahogany finish that glowed under the recessed lighting of the dressing suite. Then came the gown. It was a deep, midnight emerald that clung to her curves before flowing into a structured train. It was the color of envy and old money. When the double doors to the drawing room finally opened, Joon-seo was waiting. He was leaning against the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking every bit the cold architect of this ruse. He began to turn, his expression set in its usual mask of boredom, ready to critique a business investment. The mask shattered. His glass paused midair. The sharp, predatory focus in his eyes softened into something unreadable, something startled. Kemi stepped into the light, the silk of the gown whispering against the marble. She no longer looked like the girl who scrubbed his floors. She looked like the woman who owned the floor she walked on. Joon-seo stood up straight, his gaze traveling from the elegant slope of her shoulders to the confident set of her jaw. For the first time, he didn't see a shield to hide behind or a tool for his revenge. The cold, calculated distance he maintained like armor began to fray at the edges. "The stylists, they did as I asked," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It was lower, caught in the back of his throat. "They did more than that," Kemi replied, meeting his eyes without blinking. "They made me visible." Joon-seo set his glass down, his movements uncharacteristically slow. As he walked toward her, the rhythmic click of his shoes on the floor sounded like a heartbeat. He stopped just inches away, the scent of his wood smoke cologne swirling around her. He reached out, his thumb hovering just a fraction of an inch from her cheek, his icy composure finally showing a crack of genuine, terrifying heat. "No, Kemi," he whispered. "They just made it impossible for me to look away." The neon pulse of Gangnam's most exclusive underground lounge felt like a heartbeat Kemi was struggling to match. As the heavy obsidian doors swung open, the air grew thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp tang of chilled gin. Joon-seo didn't just enter the room, he claimed it. His hand was a firm, grounding weight against the small of Kemi's back, his red suit a defiant beacon against the shadows of the club. The music didn't stop, but the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned, whispers traveling through the VIP booths like a contagion. This was the underworld's gaze, heavy, judgmental, and hungry for a slip-up. "Stay close," Joon-seo murmured, his lips barely moving. "They're looking for a maid, show them a queen." They were intercepted before they reached their table by Park Sang-hoon, a rival boss whose smile was as sharp as the switchblade rumored to be tucked into his boot. He was a man of old prejudices and louder ambitions. He blocked their path, his eyes raking over Kemi with a dismissive sneer that made her blood boil. "Joon-seo," Sang-hoon drawled, his voice cutting through the bass. "I heard you found a new flower for your garden, but this one looks like she belongs in the kitchen, not at the high table. Does she even speak the language of profit or just the language of laundry?" Joon-seo's jaw tightened, his frame tensing beside her, but before his hand could move toward his inner pocket, Kemi stepped forward. She didn't shrink, she expanded. "Mr. Park, I presume," Kemi said in flawless, melodic Korean, her voice carrying a calm authority that silenced the immediate circle. She tilted her head, her emerald gown shimmering. "It's interesting you mention laundry. In my experience, those who obsess over the dirt in other people's houses usually do so because their own ledger is too filthy to look at. I believe your recent shipping logistics in Busan are currently underwashed." The insult was surgical. She had overheard Mr. Lim discussing Sang-hoon's botched port deals earlier that week. The rival boss's face went from smug to ashen in a heartbeat. The surrounding men chuckled, a low, dangerous sound of shifting respect. Joon-seo's hand returned to her waist, but this time, his fingers squeezed with a different kind of intensity. As they walked away, leaving a stunned Sang-hoon behind, Joon-seo leaned in, a rare, genuine glint of pride dancing in his dark eyes. "I hired a shield," he whispered, his voice thick with newfound heat. "I didn't realize I'd brought a sword." The adrenaline from the club hadn't yet faded when the world turned sideways. They were walking through the estate's private rose garden, the midnight air heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming petals, when the silence was shattered by the rhythmic asterisk thwip of a silenced barrel. Joon-seo reacted before Kemi could even register the flash of steel from the perimeter wall. He threw his weight into her, his red suit jacket a blur as he forced her behind the stone pedestal of a fountain. A grunt escaped him, not of pain, but of startled impact. "Stay down," he hissed, his hand reaching for the holster hidden beneath his ribs. The skirmish was over as quickly as it began. Mr. Park and the security details swarmed the shadows like ghosts, the muffled sounds of a struggle disappearing into the tree line. It was only when the garden fell silent again that Kemi noticed the dark stains spreading across the crisp white of Joon-seo's shirt. The bullet had grazed his upper arm, a jagged tear that wept crimson against the fair polish of his skin. He tried to stand, his face a mask of frozen stoicism, but the blood was flowing too fast. "It's nothing," he gritted out, though his breath hitched. "Inside now." Once behind the heavy oak doors of his private quarters, the Mafia boss faltered, leaning heavily against the vanity. Kemi didn't wait for permission. She stripped off her emerald stole and moved with a clinical precision that had nothing to do with being a maid. Back in Lagos, she had watched her mother tend to her father's dialysis ports and treat neighbors when clinics were too far. "Sit," she commanded. It wasn't a request. Joon-seo looked up, startled by the steel in her voice. He sat. Kemi tore a clean linen cloth, her hands steady as she cleaned the wound with antiseptic. She didn't flinch at the sight of the raw flesh. As she applied pressure, her fingers brushed against his shoulder, her mahogany skin a warm, living contrast to his pallor. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. In the quiet of the room, surrounded by the scent of roses and iron, Joon-seo's eyes lost their predatory edge. He watched her work, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The ice didn't just melt, it evaporated. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his fingers barely grazing the white apron she still wore beneath her gown, realizing that the woman he'd hired to play a part was the only person in his world who knew how to heal. The peace that followed the night in the garden was a fragile illusion, shattered by the morning glow of 1,000 smartphone screens. By 8:00 a.m., the Emerald Queen had been stripped back down to a domestic worker in the eyes of the public. Han Soo-yeon had struck back with surgical spite, leaking Kemi's initial employment contract and a grainy photo of her in the blue Peter Pan collar to Seoul's most ruthless tabloid, the Gilded Eye asterisk. The headline was a venomous smear. "Gangnam's Red King playing house. The lover is just the help." Kemi stood in the center of the kitchen, her hands cold as she watched the comment sections fill with vitriol and racial slurs. The invisibility she had once feared had been replaced by a spotlight that felt like a firing squad. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, news of her fraud reaching even the Nigerian expat forums. Joon-seo entered the room not with a limp, but with a terrifying, quiet fury. He didn't look at the news. He looked only at Kemi, whose shoulders were rigid with the weight of a humiliation she hadn't earned. He was dressed in a suit the color of a bruised sky, his wounded arm tucked discreetly against his side. "Mr. Park," Joon-seo said, his voice a low, chilling vibration. "Who owns the parent company of the Gilded Eye?" "The Choi Group, sir. They've been looking for an exit strategy for months." "Buy it," Joon-seo commanded, his eyes never leaving Kemi's. "Buy the building, the brand, and every digital server they own. I want the transaction finalized before the markets open." 10 minutes later, the article vanished. A 404 error replaced the scandal. In the heart of the city, the editor-in-chief of the tabloid was escorted from his office by security guards wearing the Kim estate crest. Joon-seo walked toward Kemi, closing the distance until the scent of his wood smoke cologne masked the smell of her rising panic. He reached out, his hand steadying the phone in her trembling grasp. "I told you, Kemi," he whispered, his thumb grazing her knuckles. "In this house, you are an equal, and in my world, no one speaks a lie about my equals and keeps their voice." For the first time, Kemi saw past the boss and the protector. She saw a man who would burn a city down just to keep her name clean. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of monochrome, black tuxedos and shimmering silver gowns, until the doors at the top of the marble staircase swung open. The air in the room didn't just still, it vanished. Kemi stood at the precipice of the underworld's elite, her hand resting firmly on Joon-seo's uninjured arm. They were no longer playing a game of subtle hints. They were a declaration. He wore his signature crimson suit, tailored to a lethal edge, but it was Kemi who commanded the room's oxygen. Her gown was a masterpiece of draped silk in the exact, defiant shade of red as his jacket. The bold color against her deep mahogany skin was a visual symphony, a middle finger to every tabloid and socialite who had tried to relegate her to the shadows of a kitchen. As they descended the stairs, the rhythmic click of Kemi's heels echoed like a drumbeat. Joon-seo leaned toward her, his posture relaxed yet fiercely protective. "Don't look at the crowd, Kemi," he murmured, his voice a low hum beneath the rising whispers. "Look at me. You are the only person in this room who matters." At the base of the stairs, the commission, the iron-fisted rulers of Seoul's shadow economy, watched with narrowed eyes. Han Soo-yeon stood among them, her face pale with a mix of fury and fear. She had expected Kemi to hide, to crumble under the weight of the leaked records. Instead, she was staring into the eyes of a woman who wore the boss's colors like a birthright. Joon-seo led Kemi directly to the center of the dance floor, ignoring the outstretched hands of influential men and the hungry stares of the press. He turned her into his arms, his hand sliding to the small of her back with a familiarity that sent a jolt through the room. As the orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz, Joon-seo pulled her closer than the contract had ever required. In the heat of the spotlight, surrounded by enemies and vultures, Kemi didn't feel like a maid or a pawn. She felt the steady, frantic beat of Joon-seo's heart against her own, and she realized that the red they wore wasn't just for show. It was the color of the blood they had spilled together, and the fire they were about to set to the world. The music of the ballroom was a muffled hum behind the heavy gold leaf doors of the private salon where Soo-yeon had cornered Kemi. The air here was cold, scented with the bitter metallic tang of desperate privilege. Without the crowd to witness her, Soo-yeon's mask had slipped, revealing a face ravaged by a losing streak. She didn't scream this time. She simply slid a check across the velvet-top table. "It's more than he offered you," Soo-yeon hissed, her eyes darting to Kemi's red gown with visceral loathing. 3 billion won. Take it and disappear back to Lagos. A girl like you, a servant in a borrowed dress, doesn't belong in a world where the blood is as old as the buildings. You're just a temporary irritation to him, a tool to make me blink. Well, I've blinked. Now go." Kemi looked down at the check, then back at the woman whose mustard yellow dress now looked like the uniform of a ghost. The Kemi of 3 months ago, the girl with the trembling tray and the mounting debt, might have seen a lifeline. But the woman standing in this room felt only a profound, crystalline pity. "You think this is about the money," Kemi said, her voice like smooth, dark silk. She picked up the check, and for a heartbeat, Soo-yeon's eyes lit with a triumphant spark. Then Kemi tore it in half, then into fourths. "You spent years with him and still don't understand that Joon-seo cannot be bought, and neither can the woman he chooses." "Choosing you," Soo-yeon laughed, a jagged, brittle sound. "You're a contract, Kemi, a business transaction." "Actually," a low, dangerous voice vibrated from the doorway. Joon-seo stepped into the light, his red jacket stark against the shadows. He walked to Kemi's side, his presence an immediate, grounding heat. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled handful of paper scraps. "I shredded the contract the night I saw you in the garden," Joon-seo said, his gaze never leaving Kemi's stunned face. "I didn't need a signature to keep you, Kemi. I needed a reason to deserve you. The 6 months were a lie, but this," he reached out, his fair hand tangling gently with her mahogany fingers, "this is the only truth I have left." Soo-yeon's mouth fell open, a silent gasp for air as the realization hit. The transaction was over. The real story had already begun. The fortress of glass and steel in Gangnam was finally quiet. The red suit, once a symbol of blood and intimidation, had been folded away for the last time. Joon-seo had dismantled his empire with the same cold precision he'd used to build it, selling off the clubs and the dark assets until all that remained was the man himself. He stood in the entryway of the empty mansion, his hand entwined with Kemi's, no longer as a protector and his ward, but as two souls bound by a shared fire. The flight to Lagos was a transition between worlds. As the plane touched down on the tarmac of Murtala Muhammad International Airport, the dry, salt-tinged breeze of the Atlantic rushed into the cabin. It was a world away from the sterile chill of Seoul. Kemi felt the familiar rhythm of the city's pulse as they pulled up to the modest, sun-drenched villa on the outskirts of Victoria Island. A home paid for with the final, legitimate earnings of a man who had chosen a different path. The door opened, and Kemi's father stepped out into the light. He looked strong, his eyes clear and his gait steady, the shadows of the dialysis machines long forgotten. He paused, his gaze moving from his radiant daughter to the fair-skinned man standing beside her in a simple linen shirt. There was no need for translations or titles. He saw the way Joon-seo looked at Kemi, not with the intensity of a boss, but with the quiet, humble devotion of a man who had finally found home. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the lagoon, painting the Nigerian sky in shades of deep gold and amber, they sat on the veranda. Joon-seo watched the vibrant life of the street below, a small, genuine smile tugging at his sharp jawline. He reached for Kemi's hand, his fair skin glowing against her mahogany radiance under the tropical sun. "You promised me a life inside yours," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. "And you promised me I wouldn't be invisible," Kemi replied, her voice thick with a joy that had no price tag. The pretense was over. The contract was ash. In the warmth of the Lagos evening, they didn't need to pretend anymore. They were simply, finally, home.